So I think we can get going. So thanks everybody for making some time on Saturday morning to join us here for Sabre Day. Really glad to be able to do this for the Ottawa chapter. So I'll maybe just before we introduce our great guest here, Justin, just a quick plug. The Ottawa chapter is going to be publishing a book out next week on the history of baseball in the Ottawa area. And I don't know if people on the call here have been part of that. So if you haven't already, I'd encourage you to check it out. I think it's a really great effort and a nice project for our chapter to have pulled that together in last year. So by all means, I'd encourage you to check it out. We are very fortunate to have Justin McKinney with us today. Justin is also a member of our chapter, but he is an accomplished author who wrote an amazing book on the history of the Union Association, which if you've not checked it out, I would highly encourage you to do. It's a wonderful read, and I really think you'll enjoy it a lot. But today he's here to talk to us about the subject of his next project, Billy Geer. So without any further ado, I will turn it over to Justin. Thank you.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Yeah, glad to be here. And yeah, I'll just share my screen and then we'll get the ball rolling here. So, and I have a bit of a cold, so pardon me if I have a little bit of a scratchy voice or a bit of a cough. So, I need to share my screen just for the presentation. So, it's when I click on it, it just says I can send a request. So,
oh, you should be able to now.
Okay.
That...
Oh yeah, there it goes. Yeah, that's great. So let me just pull up the presentation here. And yeah, so today we'll be talking about Billy Geer. I'm guessing most of you have not heard of him, other than good friend Bill Carroll, who is quite well versed in Billy Geer's life and times, and it's one of the inspirations for this project as well. So give him a lot of credit for getting me hooked on one of the more interesting figures in 19th century baseball. So yeah, presentation is called Billy Geer, the Prince of Crooks. I'm Justin McKinney. And so yeah, we'll just get the ball rolling. So we can talk a little bit about his early family life. William H. Billy Geer is you typically call Billy Geer, or W.H. Geer, different things like that. He was born around 1855 in New York City. We don't have his exact birth date or certificate, and there's good reason for that. He was a pretty tough guy to track down, but he was born to Seth Geer and Angie DeGroof, and his father was a conductor on the Erie Railroad and later an alderman in Hudson, New Jersey, which is just a suburb of Jersey City. His mother died suddenly at 1866 at the age of 33, so around the time he's 11, 12 years old. And so from there, the family sort of seemed to scatter a little bit. The next time we hear from him, he's living in New York City as a teenager and enrolled at Manhattan College in 1870, where he had spent the next 4 years. He played for the Jaspers, which was the college team. So he was one of the early college-educated players in baseball, and he also was, this is where he got started playing baseball. And we don't know much about his educational career. The existing records for Manhattan College only mention that he sang in the school choir and that his father paid his tuition. And there's a couple notes saying he attended some medical classes at Fordham College, but it's not clear in Fordham records if that ever happened. And one of the things to note about Billy Geer is because of who he was, you have to take everything with a grain of salt when you hear about him. So, but there's a nice photo of him in around 1876 with the Syracuse Stars. Yeah, but yeah, this is sort of his pre-baseball life. So his baseball career is not especially noteworthy. In the sense that, he bounced around a bunch. He didn't have that extensive a career. And yeah, so we can run through quickly kind of what his baseball life looked like. In 1874, he played a couple games for the New York Mutuals. At that point, he was probably one of the best amateur players in New York City. He was starting for the Flyaways, which was like the best club in the city that wasn't in professional, and he got a trial late in the season. He also umpired a couple games in the National Association, and from there he joined the New Haven Elm Cities in the National Association, and that was his first full season. That team was one of the worst teams of all time. Not really his fault, but yeah, he was a talented young shortstop, infielder, great defensively, couldn't really hit a whole lot, but he was, very promising young prospect at that point in time. And then in 1876 and 1877, he joins the Syracuse Stars, which was an independent club. But in 1876 in particular, they're probably the best club in the world that wasn't in the National League. They had a 4-1 record against National League teams that year. They played just about everyone. They won all these various tournaments against like other independent teams, and Billy Geer was a big part of that. Just playing shortstop and leading off, and just kind of just being a real kind of fast hitting, fast, skillful, intelligent player who just had great speed and really solid defense. So that earned him a spot in 1878 with Cincinnati in the National League, where he had probably one of his best major league seasons to date. And he helped the team to a second place finish. He was very popular in Cincinnati. There's lots of notes about him in the local papers by O.P. Kaler, who was like a famous Cincinnati sports writer. He seemed to have real fondness for Billy. But he retired after the season because he had met his wife in Syracuse in 1877, and his wife was from a well-to-do family, so he went back to Syracuse to go into business with his father. But within a year, he's applied to every major league team asking for a job, and he plays a couple games in 1880, and he's a restless guy, so he can't actually ever settle down and leave baseball behind. So he's applying to be an umpire, or he's playing semi-pro ball, or he's doing all these sorts of things. He can never quite shake the baseball bug. And so in 1883, he returns to baseball full time after pretty much a 5-year hiatus from professional baseball, playing for Brooklyn in an interstate association. He leads that team to the pennant as the team captain. Is noted again for his wonderful defense. By this point, he's nearing 30, but he still, has his speed. And that team joins the American Association, and that's the team that becomes the Brooklyn Dodgers and now the Los Angeles Dodgers. But in 1884, he joins the Philadelphia Keystones of the Union Association, my baby, and he plays 9 games there. But the Keystones were notoriously poor club that was having trouble paying their players and things like that. So even within a couple weeks of the season, it's already a sign that's going to be bad. So at the end of April, after just 2 weeks, he jumps the club to go rejoin Brooklyn in the American Association, and he has kind of his best year of his life there as a shortstop. He leads the American Association in a bunch of fielding categories, and that earns him one final stint with Louisville in 1885 as, again, he's signed as a team captain. And then, after it goes awry, he joins Hartford in the Southern New England League, and that's kind of his final stint in professional baseball. So we can get into sort of, here's a photo of the 1876 Stars. It's one of the few photos that exist of him. He's in the bottom row to my left, lying on the ground there. Between with the other fellow on the other side. And this team was probably the best team in baseball that wasn't in the National League in 1876. And so, playing style, here's a woodcut of him from 1878 when he's with Cincinnati. So he's an outstanding defensive shortstop. There's numerous mentions of him being the best shortstop in baseball just for his ability to range and catch fly balls and get to balls that no one else could get to. But he was a notoriously light hitter. He's a pretty slight fella. He's 5'6", 160 pounds, as was playing weight, but he had a lot of speed, and he was a really athletic guy. And so it's for major league career display playing, 1874 to 1885, it's only accounted for 232 games, about 900 at bats. He had 1.6 career WAR. Not that matters to 19th century baseball so much, but he was just a pretty middling player overall, just because his hitting was so poor. He had 214, 261, 279. The 848 fielding average belies the fact that it's about 10 points below league average for the time he played, but it belies the fact that he had just outstanding range, and at his best he was getting to balls that no one could get to. And yeah, like I said, he led the American Association in putouts, errors, double plays, and range factor. So yeah, he was just like a prototypical, light hitting shortstop who, could get to balls, but just couldn't get on base. And the few times he did get on base, he had tremendous speed, could make a difference just on the base path, but just he could never quite develop that skill to get on base consistently. So yeah, he was also best known for three things, like you said, his outstanding range at shortstop. He was also known for his constant chatter during games. He was referred to as the champion kicker and a chronic chinner. There's these notes about he would just constantly be talking with guys on base. He'd be mumbling stuff to them, like insulting them, like all sorts of stuff. He was just always talking, and people sort of drove people crazy just because he wouldn't shut up. But he's also very intelligent, and he was once described as the smartest and most well-rounded man in baseball. This was partly due to his education, but also he was a very, very bright guy. And he's sort of credited, at least in one source, as pioneering the shortcut play. This became an infamous play in the 1890s with like the Baltimore Orioles, where say you're on first base, there's a base hit, the umpire has to look to the outfield to see where the ball is. So the runner on first just runs straight across to third base rather than going to second base. And it's like an illegal play. But Billy Geer, at least one source, was credited with pioneering the play. And then King Kelly really popularized the play, and it turns out Geer was teammates with King Kelly in 1878 during King Kelly's rookie season in the National League. So there's a likelihood that he, showed him the play and kind of became an iconic play during 19th century baseball until they added a second umpire. And here's another photo of him in the Stars uniform. The only baseball photos we have are from Syracuse, from his 2 years there. There's 3 or 4 team photos that exist, and so yeah, get to see him in all his glory, and so that's sort of it's on the diamond techniques. So we can culminates in the end of his baseball career. So in May 1885, after about a month into the season, he's released by Louisville for poor play, and he's accused of only caring about his paycheck. There's just some notes just that make him sound like a pretty unsavory character. But he also was hitting 116, so it wasn't necessarily like his play was, going to keep him in the league much longer. Like whatever modest hitting ability he had totally disappeared in 1885. And then he joins Hartford, which was managed by one of his old teammates. And in July 1885, he forges the name of a Hartford treasurer to cover outstanding hotel bills, and he quits the club and never plays professionally again. And so, yeah, that's sort of like a hint at where his life is going to be going. And then in summer of 1887, he begs his old friend O.P. Kaler, who's now managing the New York Metropolitans of the American Association, for an umpiring job. He officiates a couple games, and this ends up being his last connection to professional baseball. So, title of the presentation, Billy Geer, the Prince of Crooks, and his life is marked by his criminal activities, which we'll get into, but even during his playing career, there were some warning signs that were concerning. So in 1875, when he's with New Haven, Geer and teammate Harry Luff, who one Philadelphia magistrate described as the worst person in the world. He was an alcoholic, wife beater, probably killed a woman, yet still avoided jail and kept playing professional baseball into like the 1880s. But he was accused, along with Geer, of stealing expensive overcoats and a gold watch from a London, Ontario hotel, as the Tecumseh Hotel in London. And he was also accused of stealing a policeman's revolver during that year. They were eventually acquitted because they couldn't get witnesses to come down from London to New Haven to appear at trial and testify, on the matter. And so they're both acquitted, but it also put a stain on his reputation. And then in 1877, he married Emily Smith of Syracuse, and she was the daughter of a wealthy businessman in Syracuse, one of the most prominent figures in the town. And by late 1870s, he was accused of forging her father-in-law's name to cover gambling debts. And this story Geer would tell 40 years later about his entrance into the life of crime was that in 1877, after his father passed away, he inherited $30,000 from him and then claimed he gambled it all away. And so there's some red flags in his early career, and his early during his baseball life, that things aren't quite what they seem. So after his career, so in summer 1885, he moves to Westchester County to raise chickens, which is an unusual profession given that he was a documented city boy, who had, only ever done any sort of modest clerical work. And but he wasn't like a farmer, wasn't used to living that kind of life, to my knowledge. Um, but it seems to be a bit of a front. During the next 18 months, Geer would rent 4 different properties in the county, and each of them would burn down. And arson was suspected in each case, and the cause was suspected to be insurance fraud. And it's almost certainly Billy Geer was the arsonist, just given that the same thing kept happening. He'd move some furniture in, burn it down. And in the first two, he set the whole house on fire while his family was still inside. I'm not sure if this was like just strictly sociopathy, or that he was trying to bolster like the story that it was an accident, or that it was like a fluke. Because the family's inside. What arsonist, even in the right mind, would set fire to a place with their family inside? But yeah, he eventually stopped doing that. But there's a couple of close calls, so it just there's a bunch of red flags with this guy. And then in summer 1887, part of the reason his officiating career kind of ends so quickly is that he had defrauded O.P. Kaler out of 6250 with a bogus check. And part of the sob story was that he needed money, so that's why I want to be an umpire. So can you get me a job as an umpire? But also, hey, I have this check, can you cash it for me? And this is a thing he was doing at the time. He had started to forge much more regularly. And then in fall 1887, so he goes on a big foraging spree in New York and Michigan and Detroit. And it results in his first arrest, his first documented arrest anyway. And then he is able to enlist his brother-in-law to pay back fraud victims, and then he jumps bail in Albany. And so you just, you know, you get a sense of where he's going with this sort of stuff. He's departed friends and family, and he's able to manipulate people and take advantage of people, and he doesn't seem to have any compunction about doing any of that sort of stuff. Um, so yeah, this is a photo of the St. Thomas Episcopal Church in Westchester County. And so he was living on the grounds here at one point, and he burned down the rectory building that he was renting, that he was going to move his family into. And so just wanted to include that just to give you a sense of what the area kind of looked like. So yeah, so his career is over as of sort of 1887, and then his family life is kind of hanging on a thread, just because when you try and murder your family several times, it tends to reflect poorly on you and cause strain in the relationship, surprisingly enough. And so by late 1888, he had abandoned his wife and 2 children, and he was working at a struggling glassware company in New York City. He gets laid off. It's unclear, what the circumstances are, if he was doing any fraud there, but he goes on drinking and foraging spree. He ends up in Louisville, Kentucky, the site of his last major league appearance back in 1885, and he's arrested. He blames whiskey for his troubles, and he's given an ultimatum of facing trial or leaving town. So he leaves town within a couple hours. But the next month, he's rearrested in Illinois on more forgery charges, and he's sentenced to his first stint in prison, at Joliet, at Illinois State Penitentiary in Joliet. It was a notorious prison at the time. There's a photo here of the prison. It being constructed, I think, in 1849, and was just a famously tough place. They had a real tendency to put people in solitary confinement and all sorts of stuff. It was a really brutal prison. And yeah, and that was his first introduction into incarceration. And so this might beg the question, like, why poetry? Like, why would Billy Geer, who was known to be quite intelligent, and like had a lot of social skills and could do a lot of different things, why forgery would become like his choice of behaviors? And it's worth noting just how the culture of forgery changed after the Civil War. Currency was standardized across the United States, and checks had become a widely accepted way of paying for things. So it just became standard that businesses, banks, you could deal with checks, and it was an accepted practice. And so this gave rise to foragers who took to the field like a duck to water. So there are two primary methods of foraging at the time. There's what's called raised drafts, where you take a legitimate check of draft that had been filled out with like the numbers and the figures, and you'd alter the figures through chemical processes and foraging skills, and you could turn like say a check for $50 into a check for $5,000 if you had the skills to do it. And it's a pretty fascinating process how guys would do it. And it was a cat and mouse thing where the banks would then keep trying to change the formula for the checks and the inks they used to battle the forgers. It was like sort of back and forth, and everyone like the arms race was on. And then the forged check method, which is very similar to what you'd see now, like not that everyone writes checks so much nowadays, but you take a check, you fill out information on it that's fraudulent. Either you fake the amount, you fake the name, you fake the signature, yada yada. And so this was Billy's method. He didn't do the raised drafts thing. Raised drafts also typically those guys kind of worked in groups, whereas Billy Geer always worked alone. And so yeah, Billy Geer's tactic was you have a blank check filled out with fraudulent information, and then cash the check in a place. And so this was enabled also by just rapidly improving railroads. You had like the transcontinental railroad sort of developed, so during this time, and so it just made travel much more viable and easy and cheaper than it had ever been before. And so forgers could travel widely and make quick escapes. And then conversely, the rise of the telegraph, fast modes of communication allowed for information to spread quickly. So again, there's like a cat and mouse game where, you know, the things that are enabling you to do some of the fraud are also the things that are making it easier for police to catch you. And you have the guys of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, which was kind of the first national body that could bring together a lot of intel and police information and connect things and sort of start to look at things on a national scale. Because typically, if you committed a crime in one town, it's just in that town, and then you move on, and that police station is never going to tell anyone else about this. But with the Pinkerton Agency getting involved, it made it possible to spread information about criminals and crime widely across the nation. And so the paradox of check forging is that it only becomes a crime once you've passed the bad check. And the recipient of the check is simply unaware a crime is being committed. So the act of writing a check with bad information is not a crime. It's only once you hand the check to someone and say, this is legitimate, And so that's the thing that's interesting about the crime, because no one suspects you doing a crime while you're doing the crime. And so it makes it very safe in a way, in that you can avoid detection if you're good at this. And then at this time, there's typically a lag time of several days between the check being cashed and a bank being notified. So it was ample time for the forger to evade detection. And using the railroads and all sorts of methods, you could just be long gone by the time anyone realized there was something that had gone wrong. And Billy Geer took advantage of this. He'd flood each new city with forgeries and then quickly catch a train to the next town. And so he has this one last moment of kind of like, we see the potential that he could have had a good life, could have had normal life, could have done good in the world. So he was released from prison in Joliet in spring 1890 and moved his Centre Maurice, I don't think they say it, Centre, in Long Island after his release. He was reunited with his wife and family. He buys a home there. And for over a year, he lives an idyllic life in the community. And I found this a nice quote about his time there. So it's I think it's in the Brooklyn Union in October 1891. At Centre Maurice, Mr. Geer was popular was known for his jovial manners, and he was popular with all. A familiar sight in the village was the Geer family driving about in a handsome surrey, which was a carriage drawn by a well-fed horse. Mr. Geer was an enthusiastic fisherman and gunner and was fond of yachting, being a member of the East Bay Yacht Club. Mr. and Mrs. Geer attended St. Paul's Episcopal Church, while in Patchogue, which is another town nearby, where Mr. Geer sang in the choir, and both were prime movers in various entertainments given in Ackerley's Music Hall. As an actor, Mr. Geer possesses some talent, and Mrs. Geer displayed unusual histrionic ability. And it's just fascinating to me that he could just put it all together and just be normal. And the thing with Geer that I think was always in question was he never really held down a job per se. His wife had received an inheritance of $4,000 a year from after her father's passing in 1881, and so that was what she was living off, and that would have been more than enough for the family to live comfortably. While Billy pursued some legitimate, pathway. Um, but at this point, it's not clear what he's doing work-wise, other than just kind of doing all this kind of social activity and things like that. But if he wanted to, the family could have lived very comfortably off the inheritance. He could have, again, done something productive with his time, and things could have been happy and normal. But with Billy Geer, there's never anything that's normal. So in fall 1891, he headed to Denver, claiming to have a new job as an insurance agent. This was the story he had been telling people in town, that I made all my money in the insurance industry out west. There's no evidence that ever happened. And then he claims he's got a new job there, so he's got to go to Denver. So he leaves his family behind, armed with letters of recommendation from leading citizens in the town. He begins foraging once again. So this was a common tactic, that if you showed up in town and you went to a bank and they didn't know you, you'd have a lot of trouble doing business. So if you had like letters of recommendation, or you could meet someone in town that could tell take you to the bank and show you around and tell you, oh, this is Billy Geer. He's in town, he's doing business, and he's a good guy. That was sort of the premise. Um, and at this point, the reason it's called the death of Billy Geer is that he started using aliases exclusively at this point. For all his previous crimes, he had used his own name. And when he went to prison in Illinois, he was using his own name. So he's in prison as William H. Geer. But then, yeah, he begins using aliases exclusively. He abandons his family one final time. And then he starts crisscrossing the country. So he spotted in Denver, Louisville, and then ends up in Minnesota in spring 1892, where he's, arrested again. This time he was trying to cash both checks at a bank. I think they're for large amounts, like $400, which is quite a substantial sum at the time. And so the bank catches on, and they detain him, and he's arrested. And he's using, again, like an alias. This time he's known as O.H.W. Dwight, which is the name of the American Express manager in Boston. And so, yeah, he's using this name. He denies that even though the papers start saying, no, he's actually Billy Geer. We found letters to his son, like, on his possession. He denies that, and he just goes by the name of Dwight. And that's what he ends up being sentenced to prison as. So his prison records are all under this alias. Yeah, and his wife and family disown him. And she eventually divorces him while he's in prison in 1896. He's sentenced to 7 years at Stillwater Penitentiary for forgery. He serves time under the alias, like I said. And during this time, it's fascinating because he became actively involved with the prison newspaper. So he was writing articles for the prison newspaper. And then he's also an active member of the prison Chautauqua Circle, which was a big 19th century, early 20th century phenomenon of like adult education. So speakers would travel around and give talks, and the idea of edifying and helping adults learn new things and improve themselves. And he became the head of it in the one that existed at Stillwater Prison. He's named president. He's a model prisoner, and he's paroled in 1897. This is his mugshot upon being arrested in 1892. He's kind of looking a bit worse for wear, with like the unkempt facial hair and you know, sort of messy hair. And these are the titles of some of the articles he'd written. Just he's writing about like Greek history and the Silver Standard and immigration. That article on the Chinaman is pretty unpleasant. And then he even wrote a poem called Trifles. The massive gates of circumstance are turned upon the smallest hinge, and thus some seeming pettiest chance oft gives a life its after tinge. And yeah, he even wrote a long essay talking about like what a prisoner should do when he gets out to stay good. And it's very thoughtful, interesting essay. And it shows he has like the capacity for self-reflection, the capacity to understand. But it's also hard to know if like this is all front or if it's like nonsense, like if it's something that, he's just doing to just look good in prison so he doesn't get in trouble and he maybe gets out earlier, or if there's actual genuine person in there who can actually take things to heart. But yeah, there's no going back for Billy. He's got no family left. He's using aliases like full time now. He's like no one knows who he once was in his past life. And so yeah, he gets out of Stillwater, returns to foraging. He takes on the name J.B. Rowan among others, and he passes checks in Detroit, Saginaw, Salt Lake, Boston, Providence, Bay City, and Richmond. And you see he's going east to west and back again. And the Pinkerton Detective Agency issued a nationwide circular, sorry, warning merchants and banks of his methods. And yeah, here's part of the circular. No, his photo is kind of washed out just because of the copy, but you see this is all his handwriting and signatures, and like just so people can be aware, it lists like sort of his typical methods, and then just also like his age, his height, various details and things like that, as long as a bunch of his aliases. And so this was distributed nationwide to try and stop Billy because he was so prolific at this point, just hitting up places all across the country. And so, yeah, in 1898, he's caught once again and sentenced under the name of Abagnale. He's sentenced 6 months for forgery, but after 8 months, he's pardoned for medical reasons. But he does end up gain treatment because he's immediately picked up by Utah officials who came to Virginia to pick him up and take him back to Utah, and so to face charges for an 1897 forgery he'd done. And so, yeah, here's his mugshot when he entered the Utah State Penitentiary. You see he's a little bit worse for wear. He's got a short cropped hair. He just looks like he's seen better days. He doesn't look like the youthful player that he was, some 20 years ago in those pictures. And so, yeah, after his release from Utah, it's, I think, 1901, he's taken into custody by a Michigan officer who'd done the same thing, traveled across the country. And Geer, I think, sensed that given how wanted he was across the country, that he was just going to face this stint of these kind of transfers where he'd be leave one state and just be moved to another prison in another state. So he was going to face trial in Michigan on the train through Kansas. Geer, who was incredibly persuasive, he convinced the guard to free him from his handcuffs to have a smoke on the outside of the platform. The officer took him to the platform. It wasn't like he let him just go up by himself. But then Geer jumped from the moving train in the middle of the night and escaped. And so yeah, he showed his athleticism was still intact from his little baseball days. And so yeah, it gets kind of interesting here. He spent the next several years foraging all across the country. He also travels to Brazil, Argentina, South Africa, and England, likely to do forgeries, but I can't find any sort of newspaper accounts of him in those places, but I have some of the travel records and just references to him being in those places. So I suspect he was doing forgeries and other crimes, but it's not entirely clear. And he was very cagey about talking about this stuff later in his life. And he alternated between forgery sprees and then laying low. Like there'd be periods of a year where you don't really see any specific forgeries that could be tied to him. But doesn't mean he wasn't doing it. It's just there wasn't anything that went public and was obviously him. And he's wondered about the Pinkertons at this point as well. So again, he's just, getting accustomed to life on the run. And so that's part of why he's always going to a different place. And by the time he developed his preferred method. So his first couple of arrests had been for larger amounts, like checks where he'd forged $100 or $400 either to a bank or a hotel, and those kind of things people catch on. But he'd sort of figured out a way to stay under the radar. So he'd typically acquire a blank checkbook from a bank, so usually through theft. Sometimes these blank checkbooks would be sold by fences and things like that. But he either would steal from the bank or acquire this is a method. And then using an alias, he would write a check for a small amount to a local business. Excuse me. He'd use use an alias, write a check for a small amount to a local business to purchase goods. His favorite amount was $18.75 for some reason. He'd buy an item that was $9 or something to that effect, and then he would keep the change, and then he would have the goods sent to a fake address. because he wasn't interested in theft. He was just interested in getting the cash. And then he'd do this method several times in a day, and then maybe for a couple days, and then he'd move on to the next town. He'd always be claiming to be a salesman, and the checks often featured the name of a legitimate firm. Um, and he'd often have like forged letters as well that would like explain his backstory, be like, so he'd be, say, in say Iowa City, Iowa, and then he'd move on to Burlington, Iowa, and then he'd send a letter from Iowa City to Burlington in advance, and then he'd have a postmarked letter from claiming to be from his employer from the previous city with the check saying like, "Oh, here's the money for Iowa," and like he just had all these extra things to try and build his backstory and create legitimacy for his pitch. And because he was targeting merchants and small business owners, typically, like they were much less likely to suspect anything. And he always had a good story to tell. He'd mentioned his family, his daughter, like various things. And so yeah, he just had figured out his method because it is much easier to stay under the radar when you're writing checks for $18. And pocketing $8 or $10, that sort of thing. And so it's an example of one of his checks. You can see, yeah, this is made out on the Merchants National Bank of Richmond, Virginia. It's the business that he's claiming to represent is the E.B. Taylor Company, which was it's like a glassware company, I think, from New York City. And then yeah, he's got all the information there. Notice the amount is $24.75. This checks from 1907, but he used this method pretty much through the rest of his career. Once he'd figured out this is what I want, this works for me, this allows me to kind of lay low and gives me enough money to kind of live on, then that's what he did. And so he was unable to avoid prison for long. He was arrested once again in January 1904 in Burlington, Iowa. He's had a couple of bags filled with forged checks, business cards, and disguises because he got to look, be secretive and all that sort of stuff. So he had like fake mustaches and things like that, and glasses, and he often changed his facial hair just to look different. But he was always like known to be well dressed because he wanted to put up in the front that he was a legitimate businessman. He often claimed to be a salesman. So he's sentenced to 2 years at Fort Masson Penitentiary under the name Bruce Barrington. And then he's released on January 6th, and he goes on this crazy spree where over the next 14 months he hits St. Louis, Milwaukee, Louisville, Dallas, Colorado, Montana, Tacoma, Seattle, Oregon, Denver, Grand Rapids, Kansas, Indianapolis, Detroit, St. Paul, Minneapolis, Washington, D.C., Virginia, and surrounding states, they said Buffalo, Cleveland, Columbus, Hot Springs, Arkansas, Quincy, Illinois, Cincinnati, Philadelphia, New York City, San Francisco, Indiana, Omaha, Boston, and Illinois. And he also even went to Liverpool, England at some point during this period. So yeah. And then he's rearrested in Freeport, Illinois in April 1907 and sentenced to Joliet State Penitentiary, but this time he's using the name A.C. Bates. And so they never make the connection that he was the same guy who had been in prison there in 1890. So yeah, he was incredibly prolific. It's not clear he had a home base really at all. He just went place to place to place to place to place. He's always on the go. That's pretty amazing to see just all the places he was able to hit during his time. So yeah, here's his prison record, part of it from Joliet. Notice the red ink is all his aliases that he was using at this point in time. So I think at this point it tells about 36 of them. He almost certainly used more, but these are the ones that were documented by authorities at some point. So yeah, he was very prolific. And so, yeah, we'll talk about Billy Geer's kind of life philosophy because we get a glimpse of it after his stint in Joliet. Yeah, so like I said, he served time, is given an indeterminate sentence. So I think it's said to be, it could be as little as 1 day or up to 14 years. And it would just be contingent on how he did in prison. And so he's paroled in spring 1914. After serving 7 years, condition of his parole was that he maintained employment in Chicago, Illinois, where he was working for local lunch counter. But within a couple months, he was rearrested for violating the parole. He was 14 once again. And he gave an interview in the Chicago Tribune upon his arrest that gives a glimpse to his mindset. So here's some choice quotes. He said, "It's no use, Lieutenant, trying to be on the square. I've reached the point in life where my legitimate earning capacity is less than $10 a week. With me, it's a case of having a beer income and a champagne appetite." And then this says he likes his very best. I like to travel and live at the swell hotels. A cold bottle and a bird is a gentleman's dinner. I like that kind of stuff. It takes money to travel in style, and there's no easier way in the world to get the coin than to lay down bond paper. You've got to stop at first class hotels and wear good togs. If you don't make it up front, you can't get away with it. And so this it's just basically his life at this point. He's goes from place to place, voyages, he just wants to live an easy life in the sense he doesn't want to work for a living. This is what he wants to do. And so by this point, he's now, in his 60s. He's paroled in 1915, but he's apprehended once again and taken to Memphis to stand trial. By this point, he has stomach cancer, and he's pardoned on the condition they go back to Chicago to receive treatment. He states in an interview in Memphis that he'd been conning people for 42 years at that point, so it's 1916, and that would put his forgery starting around 1873, 1874, or his conning like of some kind. So that's even when he was in college. And then he returns foraging and he's arrested in Topeka, Kansas under the name S.L. Spear. And the local sheriff interviews him and comes to the conclusion that he's been to every country in the world. And then he's given an indeterminate sentence at Kansas State Penitentiary. And that's sort of an illustration of how he looked when he was arrested. So you see he's much older now. He's wearing glasses. He just looks a bit like an older man. And this quote here just covers it up. It's like, but what I did in London, South Africa, and other countries, that is a closed book. And but the sheriff who really took an interest in him, it mentions that he traveled to the United States, Canada, Mexico, and the South American countries. And yeah, and this is also the interview where he mentions that he had the $30,000 gambling debt, but also in the next sentence it mentions he'd never drank a drop of liquor in his life, and there's documented and it's even substantiated by picture reports, but we have multiple references to Billy Geer going on drunken foraging sprees. So he veered between teetotaling and alcoholism throughout his life. But yeah, so I don't know. This quote is one of the things that prompted me to want to write a book about this guy. Is just that that's such a fascinating kind of thing, and unfortunately, because of the nature of who he was and his aliases and how mysterious he was, I haven't been able to figure out what he was doing in South Africa. But I'm very fascinated by just the fact that he got around so much and that he was world traveling, and I found travel records where he's traveling under aliases, and it's definitely him. So just fascinating just how much he moved. And so he was paroled in 1918. He went back to Floridian like almost assuredly. Um, his whereabouts for the next couple years are unclear. I found a note saying he had served time in a Connecticut prison, but I can't find the corresponding prison or prison record. And there's another note saying he'd been arraigned in Beaumont, Texas. And again, I found a couple forgeries that could be him, but can't connect the dots necessarily, so hard to say. The California Banking Association issued a warning about him in 1921 that he was backed up to his whole tricks. And then he was back at work in Missouri in 1923, and he was arrested one final time in Joplin. And he was sentenced to 8 years in Missouri Penitentiary, and he asked for leniency so that he wouldn't die in prison. And yeah, he ended up serving 5 years. So he's battling stomach cancer. He's in poor health. And he's given a medical pardon in 1928. He returns to Chicago and takes up residence at a boarding house. And he died on September 30th, 1928 in Chicago under the alias of Bruce Barrington. It's the same name he was arrested under in 1904. So by my records, I've documented forgeries in at least 30 states, as well as Alaska and Canada. And he was documented to assure they have visited at least 5 different countries aside from the United States and Canada. But like I said, the one sheriff was convinced he had traveled to every country in the world. But he also was a perpetual liar, so we don't know what is true and what isn't. He used 36 different aliases. He had 8 different prison stints that totaled roughly 26 years, and each of those 8 different sentences was served under a different name. I find that very fascinating. And so that brings us one final kind of question, like the why of Billy Geer. Like why was he the way he was? Because he was college educated, came from a decent enough family. He was very bright. He married into a wealthy family in Syracuse. He had ability to read and write. He was an incredible, persuasive, talkative fellow, could make friends everywhere he went. Very popular amongst people he went in. So why would he do what he did? And so there's a few different things I think tie it all together. So there's documented stories that he was a compulsive gambler. Like he said, his origin story for entering into crime was that he lost $30,000 that he inherited. And then O.P. Kaler, who knew him quite well, said that Geer was frequenting poker rooms, and he was also known to place bets at the ballpark and stuff like that. Not during his playing career, but when he would go to games and be in attendance. The Pinkerton said he frequented bucket shops, which were like kind of these underground commodities kind of trading places where you could place bets on like all sorts of commodities and different things that you could place like bets on like microtransactions and things like that. And they were under the radar. They were eventually banned, but they're commonplace for people to gamble and spend money, and like that became a real haunt for him during his career. So any place he went, he was probably going to these kind of places and placing bets and all sorts of stuff. Because one of the things about him is for all the forgery, he never really had any money. Like when he'd be arrested, he'd have a couple $100s in his possession at most. Like there wasn't some secret store of money he was putting together. He just was forging, getting the cash in hand, spending it on like a fast lifestyle and traveling and just always on the go. At various points, he was drank excess. The 1809 arrest, he blamed on whiskey, and there's a few other notes about him drinking, but he also was an avowed teetotaler at times in his life as well. So he's sort of veered back and forth between two things, but certainly that probably influenced his behavior. He's clearly a pretty amoral guy. Like I said, he claimed to have been conning people since around 1873, so that's when he's like still, you know, like a teenager. He showed a regular willingness to hurt family and friends, and he could display exemplary behavior and win trust. Like when he wrote those articles in the prison newspaper, reflecting on his crime and reflecting on, life outside and things like that. And he was able to manipulate people, like his brother-in-law, into paying off thousands of dollars to cover his debts that he'd accrued and he should have to pay back himself. And he just was able to do this repeatedly. And the sequence with his wife and him, he would abandon his wife and then they'd reunite, and then abandon his wife and reunite, and like, it was a constant cycle until he went to prison the second time, and then he finally broke free. And he was an impulsive guy. They clearly chose short-term gratification, plus the thrill of a con. He could never hold down a steady job. He briefly was in business in Syracuse after he'd retired, but within a year he had like left the job. He left the business to go try and get back into baseball. And I found this like in a book on check forgery and kind of the psychology of it. But the lament was basically there's always a first forged check, but there's never a last. And the idea that this is a compulsive behavior that people get sucked into and drawn into. And Billy Geer was no exception. Like I think once he figured this out, and this is an easy way to do it, like, and he had the stomach for it, no pun intended. And then he just that was the rest of his life. So from his first documented forgeries in the 1870s to his death in 1928, he never stopped at any point. So yeah, that brings it to just let's say in the presentation. This is my previous book, Baseball Senior Association. That Steve had mentioned, but it's available anywhere books are sold. But yeah, check it out if you are so inclined. And yeah, I can stop sharing and happy to take any questions or if anyone has comments, things like that.
Thanks so much for
Apologies
that.
for voice.
Fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely amazing. And just like, I think what struck me was just the level of research and that you've done on this is just incredible. So well done. So we can open up for questions. I have a couple that I just want to throw out there,
Sure.
Justin. So you mentioned red flags earlier in the presentation, and that immediately when you mentioned the shortcut play, that got me thinking, like, what does that tell us, if anything, about his propensity and inclination to break the rules?
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. I think just there's a culture in baseball that was starting to develop, like as you sort of have professional baseball kind of, it starts to evolve from being an amateur game, like a gentleman's game, to like a bit more of a like competitive thing, and people starting to look for an edge. And so, yeah, I think it probably said something. There's another anecdote I found where he was called the champion bat stealer in baseball, because he would steal other players' bats. Like if he found one he liked, he'd just take it, and Yeah. And so yeah, like I think he was a guy who clearly didn't think much about the consequences of his actions, and was happy to bend the rules on the ball field, either through just incessant chatter, being frustrated, but he also umpired as well, and he was reputed to be quite a good umpire. And so it's fascinating that like he he, he had all the skills in the world to be this like actual real, he could have been very successful at anything he did, but he always kept choosing like this other thing.
Yeah. And maybe one more and then I'll open it up. But can you talk a little bit about his level of sophistication for foraging? Like, was he considered an expert check forager, and where would he have picked up this skill?
Yeah, like so there's a couple notes about, sorry about that. There's a couple notes about how he may have worked at an engraving company, and he learned some of the engravings like to do like to forge and stuff like that. But it could also be a front. Like it's hard to tell what legitimate jobs he might have held versus like what he claimed to have done. Um, but yeah, I don't think he was, this mixed notes about how his level of sophistication, because some said what he would do is like the thing he pioneered was he would have this like extra stuff to support his like forgery, is like he'd have business cards made up that matched like the business cards of the businesses he was claiming to represent. He'd have these letters that were of either introduction that were forged, like claiming to be from someone else, or the letter from like his boss, saying here's the money, and like he'd bring this exempt like extra evidence like to prove his case. And that was like the thing that was noted as being quite unique at the time. Like forgers typically weren't doing that. They were just doing this sort of stuff. But yeah, Pliny was pretty good at it, but there's also no saying that he wasn't the best or anything. But I think just he found his techniques, he found his marks, he found the people he was going to go after, and he went after those people. And it's funny, there's one case where he's arrested where they didn't recognize his mugshot, but they recognized the writing from like the Pinkerton circular that had been sent out. They like, the woman was just the cashier, she's like, hey, that looks like that. I'm suspicious, and then it led to his arrest. Um, but yeah, I think he was like reasonably sophisticated. He was innovating some techniques that were new at the time, but compared to like the guys who were, or the forgers who were doing like the raised drafts, which was a much more involved process, like he wasn't on that level. But I think he, you know, yeah, I think he wasn't like, I don't think he had the ambition to necessarily want to have to take that next level. Like if you read some of the forgeries, like I forget what it was like Jim the Penman. He would forge these incredible, like perfect replicas of like dollar bills and stuff like this, and people were like so amazed by how good this guy was. Like Billy Geer never received that level of praise for his work. At one point, I found a note where he'd gotten an engraving company to make him fake business cards, like business cards to match like his thing. But then he also paid the engraving company with a forged check, and like it's just, I don't know, just funny stuff. So
That's great. Yeah. So anybody else, feel free to jump in.
Yeah. Just Justin, is there any evidence that he could have been doing some of his bad stuff while it was in college? Since it seems like he didn't never completed college, and
yeah,
he
like
then mentions he's been doing forgery for conning for 52 years, which would bring it back to those years.
yeah, I mean, there's no evidence like his all we know about his college career is like you find a couple notes in the paper about him being involved with like the singing the choir, or like he gives like a speech at like a St. Patrick's Day event and stuff like this. And then you find box scores of him playing baseball. Um, but it's not clear he ever graduated. Like there's no record at Manhattan College they graduated, and each year they published the graduates in the paper, and he was not never listed amongst those people. So don't know quite what he got up to while he was at college. Like there's not a lot of
Mhm.
solid evidence that like what cons he might have been doing. The earliest document aside from the theft he does in 1875 is like he's noted to be forging his father-in-law's name by the late 1870s, and it's not clear if like he got married specifically with this in mind, or if this just came about because I'm pretty sure he was gambling regularly and he needed money, and that's part of the also the reason why he never had any money, was he's always easy come easy go. And so he starts forging to cover some debts and things like this. And then even his father-in-law, I guess, changed the will and made it much more difficult for his daughter to inherit the money, like the full amount, just because he was so worried about Billy Geer just taking advantage. And that proved to be the case, that he would have done this. So he gave a relatively modest $40,000 a year inheritance, which was very good money for the time, but wasn't like the level of wealth that like the family had been accustomed to and things like that. So yeah, so the earliest thing we have is like late 1870s. He's definitely foraging on some level by that point, but he pivots from like conning family and friends to like conning just anyone like by the late 1880s. Like, but there's a transition there from just like doing it like, oh, he's just in trouble, he needs some money, like versus no, this is just pathological that he's doing, and it's like he's a full-time criminal now. So
Well, I wanted to mention that uh, Geer was one of our missing players for a long time. And to try and track down the death date and whatnot of a guy who used 36 aliases is a pretty challenging task. Particularly, you know, when he died, he died under a different name uh, than you know his real name. But kind of the fortunate thing about all that is when the papers would uh, talk about his forgeries, they would often list other names he'd used, and almost always you would see W.H. Geer as one of his other names, so you could kind of keep track of him that way.
yeah, yeah, and I remember the email chain. I think it was in 2020, because Bill and Peter and Willis and I, we often are exchanging information, and the chain where we're figuring out who Billy Geer is and found him. It was like so fun. Like I remember that afternoon, just how thrilling it was, just to be like, oh, we found this guy. It felt so cool. But yeah, he's definitely one of the toughest guys just to flag down, like just because of all the aliases. And there's still so much we can't actually know. And there's like these leads that I would love to get more about. But like when he's paroled in 1915, he's paroled to work in like there's a lunch counter in Chicago, but it's owned by like a black businessman. And then when the address he's living at is like a boarding house that's owned by a woman named S.B. Turner, Sophie B. Turner, and her husband's like a state senator, but she also runs like a black newspaper. And like I don't know what his connection to the black community is in Chicago, but it happens a few times where he's in contact with this woman, and that's where he dies, at her boarding house. And it's like I would love to know more about what his involvement was in like the African American community in Chicago in the 1910s and 20s. Like what was the connection? And I like there's not a way to get that information, because like no one's alive who did it, and no one was writing about him like in that way. But I just find that fascinating. There's always like mysteries in his life that are just like still unknown, and you know maybe stuff will get discovered. But yeah, it's been a fun process to try and just track him down. I have a spreadsheet of his whereabouts, like from like his birth to like death, and it's just long. There's so many places he was.
Yeah, I was curious, Justin, like your timeline on this. Like, how did you first become aware of him, and how long have you been doing this, and how hard is it to track, to follow the path with so many aliases?
Yeah, well, I give Bill Carl and Peter Morris a lot of credit, because like I've been involved with the biographical committee for like 6-7 years now, and like they're hunting down these players that like trying to find death dates for these obscure players. Mostly the players who weren't very well known, who played one game, things like this. It became a real like fixation for me. And Bill and Peter are like two of the best to ever do it at this, and so they've helped me figure out how to do this sort of stuff. And then Billy Geer became one of those guys that was like, oh, like he's a pretty prominent player, like lots notable, most memorable in his career, but then like what happened to him. And then the criminal element is very kind of compelling, just because, well, how does a famous baseball player become also like the most prolific forger in America? Yeah, like what does that process look like? And then just so like I think the idea for the book's been in the past like year or two, but like the research we've sort of been doing ongoing, and then just have built up case files like newspapers.com and genealogy bank and different places you could just search, try to look at these different aliases, different names. Like it got to the point where I was searching like amounts like 1875, because that was his favorite check amount. Like, okay, 1875 and forgery, and like, okay, 1875 check, and like and see what comes up. And you find sometimes there's a few forgeries he did, like, and it's a new name or whatever. And so, yeah, so it's a process instigated by Bill's wonderful stewardship of the biographical committee, and then kind of my own just fixations on these things, and then just becomes like an interesting story that is never been told. Like, no one knows this story aside from like me and Bill and Peter Morris, like, you know, and so it's neat to try and bring it. So I've written a manuscript. I'm trying to find a publisher for it, and then yeah, so that's been a neat process. But yeah, like it's just it's always one thing leads to another, and then you just go down rabbit holes, and you just find like your obsession, you know, in the research. I'm sure if you remember of SABR, you have your own obsessions that you get really fixated on, and you just like want to just figure out, and you know, document it. So
For sure.
Well, amazing work, Justin. Great
Thank you.
presentation. And just to plug, Justin will be at the Frederick Eeyore Campbell 19th Degree Baseball Conference in April, presenting on this. So
Yeah.
if you happen to find yourself in Cooperstown, I'd say check it out because it's just awesome work. Can't wait to see the book when it does come out. So I think
yeah,
a
I'll
lot
keep
of
it
fans here.
once I have sort of something in play. So
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks everybody. This has been great, and enjoy the rest of SABR Day. And all right, we'll talk soon. Take care.
thank you.